This is the last lecture in a series of 5 regarding the Swedish history, and it's been heavily summarized. This picks up the story after the First World War, and the Second World War has just started. And I do not own the pictures in this slideshow, nor do I make any such claims. And I tried to link the links where I found them in the description below. Let's go. Sweden had no wish to enter the Second World War. Society was split, just like during the First World War, and the sympathies lay rather with Germany than the Allies. Trade with both England and Germany continued, but it was becoming more and more difficult, even during the early phases of the war. Cultural ties to Germany were much deeper than those to Poland. At this time, while society had already been partially Anglified, the connection to Germany was still much deeper. This is partly true even today. Sweden has much deeper economic ties to Germany than to the Anglosphere. However, English is the most obvious, second and only compulsory language besides Swedish in school. Most Swedes seem to have taken little impression of the reports of persecution of Jews. The Jewish population in Sweden was in itself rather small and in most cases rather anonymous. The economic suffering of the Germans had however been noted, and their attempts at creating a folkhem. Regarding eugenics, this was also in vogue in Sweden, having established an institute for racial hygiene in Uppsala. This goodwill towards the Germans would be eroded during the war. The lack of German support to Finland during the Winter War made a small dent, but the big dent came with the invasion of Denmark and Norway. While the feelings towards the Germans were generally warm, the feelings for the Norwegians were much warmer. Sweden's ability to resist a German invasion once it was encircled was small. The army was underfunded and rather obsolete. There was almost no anti-tank capabilities in the open, and the air force would have been wiped out within a couple of days. Thus, Sweden could only rely upon infantry fighting a rearguard action, which may have been very costly for the Germans, but there was also no real chance of winning the war, just prolonging it. During the winter 1939 until 1940, Finland had to fight for its independence as the Soviet Union pushed to regain the territories which Russia lost during the turmoil of revolution. Finland received a substantial support from Sweden, including volunteers, but Sweden did not enter the war on the Finnish side. There has been substantial speculations in Swedish pop culture that Finland wished to rejoin Sweden. From what I've been able to gather, this was proposed as one of many emergency plans in case of the Soviet Union would not let Finland remain an independent nation. There seems to have been very little actual support from the Finns for forfeiting their independence, even if Sweden seemed like a less dark option than the Soviet Union. While there was gratitude for the support, the cultural division between Finland and Sweden grew larger due to the fact that Finland in the end stood alone, without Sweden or any other country joining the war on the Finnish side. The war gave rise to another wave of immigration to Sweden from Finland, especially the far reaches of Karelia, which now was inducted into the Soviet Union. This was by no means the first wave, but it gave some more vitality to the Finnish language in Sweden. Some of the refugees were children, sent overseas to be protected from Soviet bombers, and in some cases they were orphans from Karelia. After the German invasion of Scandinavia, there were more refugees from Denmark and Norway. Sweden was partly used as a transit station for soldiers wishing to continue the fight against Germany, and thus needed to be smuggled to the British Isles. Most refugees were, however, civilian, but since fighting was rather short-lived and localized, the Scandinavian exodus wasn't that great. Most famous of the refugees would be the Danish Jews. Before they were rounded up, word leaked out, and they were smuggled to Sweden across Öresund. They weren't the only Jews coming to Sweden. There were restrictions on Jews regarding leaving Germany, and Sweden wasn't an attractive destination, being rather small, rural, and with a penchant for eugenics. The Jews who did come to Sweden weren't always greeted with open arms. In Uppsala, there were demonstrations against the influx of Jews on the university, and in southern Sweden, lists were made by fringe groups of Jews so that Germans could speedily arrest them once the German invasion would come. and there were also kibbutzes springing up in Dalarna and Jews remaining in Sweden after the war. During the war, substantial amounts of combatants would be interned in Sweden, most of them Allied airmen. Some of the soldiers from Baltic countries weren't granted asylum after the war and were shipped back to the Soviet Union where they were executed. And this caused a small crisis in Sweden. One of the primary reasons for invading Norway was securing the iron ore transfers from the Kirunavaara ore field. This wasn't the only Swedish mine which kept German war machine afloat. Substantial German investments had been made in Bergslagen, and companies like Hösch AG had their own mining fields. Without Sweden, there would have been a deficit of iron ore in Germany already early in the war. Refined products would also be exported during the war, especially ball bearings which SKF produced. There were ball bearing factories in Germany as well, and they were of great importance for the warplane production. Allied bombers targeted the ball bearing factories in Germany and partially destroyed them, but Gothenburg remained open. This factory did also produce ball bearings for the Allies, especially the British during the early stages of the war. In the end, Sweden was pressured into reducing its exports to Germany during the last years of the war. Most Swedes felt that Germany had been wronged during and after the First World War, and found it only natural that Germany wished to regain their old territories. This was done through war, was of course not a good thing, but many thought that Germany had been pushed into a corner. Operation Barbarossa was finally greeted with happiness in Sweden. The relations with the Soviet Union were bad, and the war against Finland had further soiled the relations. When asked if the Germans would transport an infantry division on Swedish rail from Norway to Finland, Sweden agreed. Sweden would also allow non-armed German troops to travel on the Swedish rail network in order to return for leave. How much of a scandal and how hard the Germans had to push for it is a matter of historical debate. Sweden did have its own National Socialist Party. It was, however, not especially successful. Anti-Semitism was low on the agenda for the Swedish voters, and the Social Democrats were already implementing the social aspects of the National Socialists. There were volunteers for the Waffen-SS from Sweden, just like there was from Norway and Denmark. In comparison with the two latter, the amounts were relatively low. There were also people who resided in Sweden who were called up for conscription within the Wehrmacht, some of them having a rather vague connection to Germany. Support for Germany would be greatly waned during the war. News of German atrocity was sweeping out to the Swedish populace. The support would start to erode quickly after the German defeat at Stalingrad. Once Finland was no longer in the war and the Holocaust was being discovered, support all but vaporized. Exports to Germany would be heavily throttled, not just by foreign pressure but also internal pressure. It would, however, not cease until the last months of the war. The Commando War in Norway made the occupation of Norway less lenient, and this decreased support for Germany further. How much the Commando War was being fought with Swedish support, open or tacit, remains a subject for debate. At least there seems to have been patrol bases in Sweden for covert operations. During the latter part of the war, there was a Norwegian police force being set up in Sweden. This was not really a police force, but rather a small army with the purpose of denying the Soviets Norway. This army would never engage in combat, but would serve Norway in the transition to a post-war civilian rule. The relations with the Soviet Union were bad. Before the Finnish surrender, the Soviets bombed Stockholm and Strängnäs. The raids were very limited in scope and were blamed on navigation errors. The Soviets claiming that they missed the Baltic Sea while looking for Turku. There were several other Soviet bomb brigades during that night, scattered all around Finland, but missing the Baltic, while hitting a tank depot was considered suspicious. This was not the only bombing of Sweden. Allied raids also hit southern Sweden, and there were plenty of German intrusions, both naval and aeronautical. During the last stages of the war, Sweden tried to use its neutrality to reduce human suffering. Most well known is the efforts of Raoul Wallenberg, who used Swedish diplomatic properties to protect Jews in the besieged Budapest. Wallenberg himself would, however, disappear, most probably dying in a Soviet prison. There were also the White Buses, humanitarian expeditions aimed at getting Scandinavians out of concentration camps, but once the situation became clear, they started to take all kinds of prisoners, including Jews. Folke Bernadotte became famous for his efforts with the buses and was later appointed to the UN to plan for a division of the British Mandate of Palestine. During this process, Lehi, also known as the Sterngang, murdered him. This would strain Swedish-Israeli relations and also create division within Israel. The waning support for Germany made Sweden turn westwards for cultural leadership. Just like the rest of Western Europe, Sweden would be heavily influenced by the Anglosphere. German would no longer be the secondary language in schools, it would be replaced with English. More and more companies started to do business in English, and universities would turn westwards. Especially youth culture would be influenced by America. One lasting influence would be the American car culture, which characteristically remained in the Swedish countryside. In time, Americanized culture would become to Sweden in the shape of Disney movies, comics, new types of fast food, music and sports. Sometimes these American exports had far more success in Sweden than in America, like Donald Duck and the Phantom. Due to Swedish being a small language, there was little market for synchronization of movies, television, technological instructions, or university course material. In time, this would mean that Swedish had to be supplemented by an additional language, most often English. Relations towards the Soviet Union were bad, very bad. Despite this, Sweden would nominally remain neutral, but in reality there was no real question where Swedish sympathies laid. However, there were also a very strong support for pacifism in Sweden, and hence neutrality was chosen. There was also a looming threat from the Soviet Union. Picking something else might have been provocative, and perhaps the consequences would have been dire. So Sweden stayed neutral and started to arm itself, the fate of Finland still being in fresh remembrance. While Finland retained its independence, the Soviet Union had much influence of Finland in the post-war years. Some might argue that Sweden bended over backwards in face of the Soviet Union, especially regarding the extradition of Baltic citizens. Perhaps there was more to the story, as nominally neutral country Sweden would engage in activities which might have been regarded too provocative from an entirely Western country. One thing that Sweden was involved in was signal intelligence, and there was an incident where a secret Swedish signal intelligence plane was shot down over the Baltic. Post-war Sweden was truly a country of wonder for those who fit into society, and those who did not was relieved from some of the pressure from the interwar years. Sweden was one of the few industrialized nations of the world which hadn't taken on extensive damage during the war. Additionally, it supplied wood products and steel, very important products when somebody wants to repair an entire country. The Marshall Plan made miracles for Western Europe and Sweden as a recipient, as well as one of the main suppliers of building materials. Now there was enough money to pay for folkhemmet, and it was truly a great time for most Swedes. Since the profits were so high, Swedish companies could easily make deals with the socialists, and this system of compromise was heralded as a truly great way of creating a society. And this time period is nowadays called the record years. During these years, many Swedish companies became big. SKF, the bearing company, was in a good shape, and its outlier, Volvo, was booming. Volvo did not just do construction equipment and lorries, they started to make cars for personal transportation. Husqvarna factories started to churn out more and more goods for civilian consumption. Saab had a slump in aircraft production and started to make very aeronautically inspired cars. The mines were still in business, even though some of the Germany-owned mines had to close. Atlas Copco made equipment for mines. Ericsson made phone networks. ASEA was doing large-scale electrification, inventing the HVDC connections. Steel mills were making good use of the ore, but there were many of them. Companies such as Hammarverken and Sandvik made equipment for steel mills and further manufacturing. Electrolux made appliances for home usage, and Bofors continued to supply the world with arms. And in 1958, Ingvar Kamprad, a second-generation immigrant from Germany, opened a furniture store in Småland. There was a shortage of workers in Sweden. The economy was booming, and ever-increasing amounts of workers were needed, especially since many Swedes were now getting higher education and moved towards white-collar jobs. Immigrants from countries such as Greece, Italy, Austria, Poland, Norway and Yugoslavia would come to Sweden for work in the post-war years. This made working at the big companies such as Volvo and ASEA more multicultural. But by far the biggest work-related immigrants came from Finland. Now a time-honored tradition. At this time, Finland was still heavily controlled by the Soviet Union and had a huge debt to the Soviet Union, a debt which the Soviet Union had decided to impose upon Finland. That meant it was very attractive for young Finns to go to Sweden for work. Most of them intended to return, but many did not. Most Finns remained in the industrial cities and the region called Bergslagen. Nowadays, Finnish is a minority language and in certain parts of Sweden a very important language. It has, however, been losing importance since many of these immigrants have died of old age. During the late 60s, the housing crisis was partially solved by building lots of flats. These flats were often placed together in new planned communities. It all looked rather nice, but in time these neighborhoods would become economically disenfranchised and home to a disproportionate amount of immigrants, and also those who were unable to sustain themselves. Even though Sweden was neutral, it spent considerable amounts of money on defense. Conscription was mandatory, and service within the armed forces were performed by most males. The armed forces was mostly supplied with local products, and thus the need of a defense industry fed additional industrialization of Sweden. The biggest winner was Saab, which continued to supply Sweden with military aircraft. In time, they will produce quite competitive designs. For a short period of time, the Swedish Air Force was the fourth biggest in the world and equipped mostly with Saab aircraft. Sweden would retain quite strong armed forces until the end of the Cold War. The forces were, however, mostly created for one mission: defending Sweden from the Soviet Union. First by sinking as many ships as possible in case of a seaborne invasion, quickly pushing any enemy foothold on land by the use of armored forces, and if this failed, slow the enemy whilst waiting for help from NATO. Sweden assumed it would lose a war against the Soviet Union, especially if weapons of mass destruction would be used. The purpose of the armed forces was to make Sweden would make it uneconomical to invade Sweden. And in case of a confrontation between NATO and the Warsaw Pact, Sweden expected to be invaded since it was en route towards Norway. In the early 80s, there was an incident close to a naval base in southern Sweden. A Russian submarine ran ashore deep within the Swedish waters and had to be towed free. It was returned to the Soviet Union, who claimed it was a regretful incident of navigational errors. Exactly how the submarine was able to crisscross the Narrows with so much faulty navigation equipment remains a mystery. The 70s was a period of stagnation in the entire Western world. Sweden was no exception, and since it had a very export-oriented economy, this became rather problematic quickly. In order to save the steel mill industry, the state itself stepped in and rescued some of the companies, creating a new conglomerate called SSAB. However, most parts of the mining industry wasn't saved, nor was the shipbuilding industry kept intact. The remaining industry had to be modernized, and Sweden was very much a part of the third industrial revolution. ABB was a part of this by developing industrial robots. For the first time since the end of the war, unemployment was common, national debt rose, and inflation was high. Sweden was partially waking up to a new reality. During the 1960s, the left was becoming more and more radicalized. There were disturbances, but they were rather torrid in comparison to the French, Italian and German riots. Life was still very good in Sweden, and there were no ex-Nazis in government like in the BRD. During this time, there was also cultural changes. Sexual morality was becoming less restrictive, and alternative ways of living were coming and going, but mostly going. The Social Democrats were affected by this cultural swing, and this was personified by the new Prime Minister Olof Palme. He supported various left-wing guerrillas around the world, such as FNL and ANC. He was turning Sweden away from the Western world, and this caused a lot of controversy. There were also several intellectuals going far out, which today is mostly regarded as something highly embarrassing. The structure of the economy was also slowly being changed with additional state control and union control, much to the dismay of several industrialists. The school system was also reformed. Now there would be only one type of primary schooling in Sweden, and gymnasium would be heavily reformed and no longer a gymnasium in previous nomenclature. All this was a bit too much, and in the election of 1976 the Social Democrats lost. They were unable to form majority government, and instead a centre-right coalition would attempt to govern. Something that proved to be very hard since the opposition was far from united. In the end, the Social Democrats would return to power in 1982, but they were considerably less radical than in the early 70s. At this time, socialism overall seemed less advantageous. The Soviet bloc was clearly stagnating, and the new liberalism caused the economy to flourish, at least temporarily. In 1986, the Prime Minister Palme was shot and killed by unknown assassins. By an unknown assassin. An addict and petty criminal, Christer Pettersson, was convicted of the murder, but the verdict was overturned in an appeal. Palme had many enemies, not just inside Sweden but also outside Sweden, and over the years there were many theories regarding the killer. South African, Chilean, CIA, Kurdish agents have all been accused, and so has the Swedish police itself. During the radical turn to the left, Sweden also started to accept immigrants on humanitarian grounds from faraway places such as Chile and Kurdistan. This was mostly connected to socialist agitation, and this trend would continue during the 80s and the 90s, with sizable contingents coming from Persia, Kurdistan, Iraq, Somalia, Lebanon, Yugoslavia and Albania. This meant that Islam became the second most common religion in Sweden. Sweden became considerably more multicultural during this time, and in the 90s there was a strife within society regarding non-European immigration. There was violence, with a small but vocal neo-Nazi scene emerging. Especially well known were the shootings by Lasermannen, a man who turned out to be disturbed and without a real plan. There was very little constructive public debate. Society was highly polarized and remained so way until the early 2000's. Many refugees arrived in Sweden with little to no capital and no skills that were accepted in the Swedish labour market, and thus they became dependent on public support and public housing, something that concentrated immigrants to a few neighbourhoods. This spatial resegregation remains to this day in Sweden. In the 90s, the Cold War ended and Sweden regained some of its old contacts in the East, especially the Baltic countries due in Swedish banks. Establishing Swedish bank in the Baltic states have, however, sometimes been quite a rocky road. The Soviet Union left behind a huge gash, and the former Soviet Republic were all falling apart economically, and thus property had to be bought for cheap if one had the right connections. Sweden would now slowly reform its armed forces. They no longer had a credible foe. There was significant economic crisis during the early 90s. There was a default in payments for property managers, and this caused a bank to fail, only to be rescued by the state. Interest rates were elevated, much to the dismay of homeowners. Generally speaking, this has affected the countryside in a lasting manner, whilst the big city recovered pretty quickly. On the 28th of September 1994, the MS Estonia sank rapidly, taking 852 lives with it. Thus it was one of the biggest maritime disasters of all time. The ship was heading from Tallinn to Stockholm. Officially, the bow visor used for roll-on, roll-off, coming loose and caused the sinking. Once this happened, the car deck took on lots of water, which made the ship very unstable and unable to remain upright, something which made evacuation very difficult. The sea was rough at the night of the sinking, but not truly exceptionally rough. The extent of this disaster gave rise to several conspiracy theories, and even though the shipwreck is considered a graveyard, albeit at sea, there have been several non-authorized dives to inspect the wreckage, most notably from the controversial German journalist Jutta Rabe. In 1995, the European Union had its fourth enlargement, and here Austria, Sweden and Finland joined the Union. Norway and Switzerland declined joining the Union at the same time. Sweden was already a part of EFTA, and thus the changes weren't extreme during the time of joining the Union. In Sweden there was considerable resistance against joining the EU. Several political parties were openly against joining, and afterwards they wished Sweden to leave the EU. The primary reason against this joining the EU was a sense of losing sovereignty and perhaps endangering the way that the Nordic economy still worked during the 90s. In the end, only 52.8% of Swedes were for joining the EU, which at this time was mostly an economic union, not the EU which we know today. Sweden would remain on the fence regarding EU for many years, declining to join the Eurozone, whilst Finland did join. Since the end of the Napoleonic Wars, Sweden hasn't been involved in interstate warfare. This does not, however, entail a strict neutrality like Switzerland. As we've already seen, Sweden was involved in anti-Soviet activity during the Cold War and sometimes in pro-German activity during the World Wars. Yet, Sweden remained more neutral than most states in the post-war era, and Sweden was heavily involved in the United Nations. Not just top politicians were provided to UN like Bernadotte and Hammarskjöld, but also quite a lot of troops for peacekeeping or peace enforcing. Swedish troops served in Congo, Korea, between Egypt and Israel, Lebanon, Yugoslavia, Kosovo, Cyprus, Liberia, Chad, Mali and Afghanistan. During the late 90s, the army was geared towards peacekeeping, and in early 00s, conscription was abolished, only to be reinstated in the late 2010s. Especially Congo, Yugoslavia and Afghanistan would be proven to be rather bloody conflicts, and there were Swedish soldiers dying on the battlefield, even though Sweden was not engaged in interstate warfare. Bloodiest of these conflicts would Congo turn out to be, with Swedish forces fighting about all sides, but suffering most casualties against the mercenaries hired by Katanga. Sweden started to invest in computing very early. There was a homegrown computer industry and rather large interest in computers from the general populace. Perhaps this was due to the long winters who kept the children inside. In time, digital technologies would prosper in Sweden. More traditional industry was partially prone to stagnation in Sweden due to the dominance of huge corporations, and thus the rather new digital industries attracted more innovation, even if it became significantly overheated in the early 2000s. There were government support for computers at home, schools were pretty early on having computers, and the university network Subnet was rapidly being connected. Ericsson was making both digital devices and networking equipment, and was thus making quite a lot of money. Sweden would further solidify its commitment to the digital technologies by launching a program to connect households to the internet with RDSL technology. Thus, the early internet had a disproportionate amount of Swedes on it and a disproportionate effect on internet culture. I guess this is one of the reasons why I'm able to make these lectures. Many thanks for your time. If you did enjoy it, consider spreading it further. And this was the last of the lectures.